Immanuel Kant, who is, I mean, you could argue he's this central figure in all of modern philosophy, once posed this question that really gets to the heart of everything.
Yeah.
It wasn't about metaphysics or logic. It was much more personal. He asked, essentially, what science do we really need? And he said it's the one that teaches us what one must be in order to be a man.
That's it, isn't it? That's the highest possible stake. Not what we can be, but what we must be.
Exactly. And for you listening to this, especially if you're a curious person, this whole quest gets so tangled. Because you look at these great minds throughout history, and for every brilliant answer, there's another, completely contradictory one.
And it feels disheartening. It's not just confusing. It's like, well, if they can agree, what hope is there?
Okay, so that's the puzzle we're tackling today. We've done a deep dive into source material that confronts this ambiguity head-on. We're looking at the huge claims from giants like Freud, Jung, Otto Rank, Kierkegaard.
The whole spectrum. Psychology, religion, existentialism.
Right. And our mission here is to really unpack these powerful, conflicting blueprints for how to live what our sources call their immortality formulas. And this is the key part, define the common flaw in all of them.
And what's so wild about this whole thing is the nature of the disagreement. This isn't some minor academic tiff.
Right.
These are, diametrically opposed blueprints for how to triumph over existence. And each one is put forward with what the source just perfectly calls maddening certainty.
Maddening certainty. I love that phrase. Because you have these unimpeachable authorities, all brilliant, all saying the complete opposite thing is true.
And the reason for that certainty, the reason it's so maddening, is that each of these systems, whether it's psychoanalysis or religious doctrine, is really a formula. It's a formula to overcome life's biggest limitation, death. It's an immortality formula. Every single one of these grand intellectual systems is rooted deep down in the originator's own personal, powerful need to be a hero, to defy being just a creature and to achieve something that lasts. The stakes are, well, they're everything. It's existential triumph or failure.
So if we're going to talk about that kind of certainty, we have to start with the man who basically drew the map of the modern mind, Sigmund Freud.
Of course.
And when he talked about human nature, he did not pull his punches. He dropped this one line that is just, it's devastating. He said, I have found little that is good about human beings on the whole. In my experience, most of them are trash.
Trash. Not flawed, not struggling. Trash.
No matter whether they publicly subscribe to this or that ethical doctrine or none at all.
I mean, that is just an incredibly brutal assessment, but you have to think about the weight that statement carries. This is maybe the greatest psychologist who ever lived. And when he casually says, in my experience, the source says it has the authority of a papal bull. It's not just an opinion. It's a diagnosis of humanity delivered from on high.
And that's where you start to see the immortality formula in action, isn't it?
Right.
He condemns almost everyone as trash, but there's an implicit exception.
Of course.
Himself. And the select few, the intellectual elite who get his system, that self-exemption is everything. He's setting up his own moral and intellectual pedestal and saying, I see the truth, and the rest of you are lost in the dark.
That's the self-righteous conviction that powers the whole thing. If you're going to create a total system of reality, you have to stand outside the mess to deliver the verdict, right? Freud's certainty in his own unique vision is the engine of his entire heroic mission.
But the downside of that is it immediately creates this intellectual war zone with anyone who disagrees.
A massive one. And almost every major disciple who broke away from him, they didn't just disagree on theory. They found a reason to look down on him, to view him with this condescending pity. They felt they had moved beyond his limitations.
It's like an intellectual Oedipus complex playing out over and over.
Exactly. Let's just zoom in on Wilhelm Reich for a second. His critique of Freud was so personal, so judgmental. He wasn't just debating the libido.
What was his claim?
Reich claimed Freud was caught in the psychoanalytic movement, basically a prisoner of his own creation and his own followers. And then he takes it a step further, an incredible step. He says Freud's terminal cancer was the result of him being shut in upon himself.
Wow. So he's saying Freud's own psychology literally killed him.
Yeah.
That's a psychological assassination.
It is. But here's the beautiful, tragic irony. This is where the whole problem of maddening certainty comes right back to bite the critic.
Because Reich himself.
Precisely. Reich's whole condemnation of Freud's limitations just loses all its power because, as the source points out, Reich was a man who was even more caught up in his own movement and who was more decisively and ignominiously undone by it.
So the very trap he accuses Freud of falling into, he falls into even harder.
Much harder. Reich's end was arguably far more tragic and self-limiting than Freud's, so the very act of judging the master becomes this act of self-entrapment for the students, this toxic cycle.
And you see a similar pattern with Carl Jung, though maybe a little less hostile on the surface?
Right, Jung's approach was more philosophical. He saw Freud's limitations, his obsession with sex and repression, not as a failure, but as a necessary part of his daemon.
Okay, let's pause on that word, daemon.
Yeah.
For anyone listening, what does Jung mean by that?
The daemon is like your personal genius or your guiding spirit. It's this unique, sometimes obsessive force that drives you and gives you your particular message. So Jung was trying to be generous, in a way. He was saying Freud's narrowness was what made him Freud. It was the engine for his discoveries.
But, and this is the trap again, right? If we apply that logic to Jung himself,
Then his own really bizarre limitations, his demonic drivenness into alchemy, the almost shamanistic quality of his own inner life, those must also be just the necessary reflections of his daemon.
so they're both trapped. Each one is locked inside his own heroic narrative, his own self-created immortality vehicle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the source just nails the irony here. It says the real pity should be for the laymen scurrying under the feet of all these giants, dropping their weighty pronunciamentos on one another.
I can feel that. Imagine trying to figure out how to live your life while these geniuses are all yelling contradictory truths at you with total confidence. It's chaos.
It is.
Okay, but let's turn to Otto Rank, because his critique of Freud is different. It's not about professional jealousy. It goes much deeper, to the level of existential capacity.
Rank's verdict was that Freud, for all his genius, shared a fundamental weakness with the common neurotic.
And what was that?
He lacked the capacity for illusion, for a creative myth about the possibilities of creation. In other words, Freud saw things too realistically. He was too scientific, too materialist, and it cut him off from life's necessary fictions.
So the only illusion Freud really allowed himself was his own science, his psychoanalytic system.
Yes, and Rank saw that as a really shaky foundation for ultimate meaning.
Why shaky?
Because that illusion, the belief in the total power of your own ideas, comes from one's own energies and not from a powerful beyond. It all rests on your shoulders. It's self-created meaning.
And that's the crucial difference. What's so insecure about self-created meaning versus meaning that comes from, a higher power?
It's the essential problem of the modern artist or the modern hero. You have to invent your own meaning, and then you have to be sustained by it. But it's your own finite, fragile energy holding the whole thing up.
Sounds exhausting.
It is. It leads to this lifelong anxiety about your legacy, your fame, because you have to constantly justify the very system you created. If that system fails, you fail. Completely.
And this brings us right to the question of faith.
It brings us straight to Kierkegaard. Because from a Kierkegaardian perspective, Freud, for all his analysis, still lacked what he called the creature consciousness of the truly analyzed man.
Creature consciousness. What exactly is that?
It's a kind of profound humility. The understanding that you are a finite, dependent creature in a vast universe. It's knowing that your own intellect, your own efforts, are ultimately pretty small against the backdrop of infinity. For Rank, Freud never got there. He never accepted that radical dependency. He was still relying on his ego's creation.
So he failed to achieve the humility that comes from submitting to a greater framework, a ready-made, powerful immortality formula like religion.
And that transition from Freud's scientific self-reliance to Kierkegaard's existential faith, it brings us to this ultimate religious ideal, the ideal of absolute transcendence.
This is Kierkegaard's Knight of Faith. Let's really try to understand this figure.
Okay, so the Knight of Faith is an almost impossible ideal. It's this figure who has completely, totally given over the meaning of their life to the Creator. They live centered on transcendent energies.
So what does that look like in practice?
It means they accept the visible world, whatever happens, without complaint. Life is a sacred duty, and they face death without a single qualm because their real life is already anchored somewhere else in the invisible dimension.
So the knight is totally engaged with the world, paying his taxes, doing his job, but at the same time, he's totally detached because his trust is elsewhere. It's a huge paradox.
A total paradox.
So what's the strength of that as a model for, mental health?
The strength is its complete openness and courage. Because this person has solved their own personal fear of death problem, they have no fear of life and death trip to lay onto others.
They don't need to control people.
Or manipulate them or shrink them to feel big. The state of the Knight of Faith is defined as the continuing openness of life out of the death throes of dread. It's freedom through ultimate submission.
It really does sound like the perfect, unbeatable immortality formula. But there's a catch, isn't there? The source points to this huge catch that separates the ideal from the reality.
Grace.
Grace.
Exactly. The catch is that this whole ideal, it's a creative illusion meant to inspire us, to lead us on. But faith itself is described as the hardest thing. And the jump to faith, it doesn't depend on your effort or your intellect or how much therapy you've had. It's a matter of grace.
It's the rub. It's what keeps it from being just another self-help program. Remember the theologian Paul Tillich had a great way of putting this.
Oh, Tillich's explanations is beautiful. He said, religion is first an open hand to receive gifts. That's grace. And only then is it a closed hand to give them.
So you can't give the gifts of the night of faith, that deep peace and security, unless you've first received them from a higher power.
Exactly. That dependency on something unearned, something external, is what protects the ideal. It prevents it from being co-opted as just another achievement you can unlock.
Okay, so now we have to put these two giants side by side. Kierkegaard's believing Christian ideal and Freud's agnostic science, and try to draw up some kind of balance sheet.
It's an impossible calculation. Who expanded others more? Who caused them to shrink less?
And the reason it's impossible is that the balance sheet is messy. If Freud was wrong to give so much priority to the visible, the material world,
Then Kierkegaard equally erred on the side of the invisible. He put so much focus on the transcendent that he often seemed to, neglect the actual joys and duties of the world he was supposed to be living in.
and you can see that tragedy playing out in Kierkegaard's own life, can't you?
Oh, absolutely. His life was, by most accounts, a pathetically driven sacrifice. It wasn't a joyful, voluntary offering. He was tormented. He couldn't form normal relationships. You could argue he turned away from life partly out of fear and failure.
So he didn't actually live in the categories that he thought in.
He didn't. Which leads to this very humbling conclusion. In the big game of life and death, nobody really stands taller than anyone else. Unless maybe it's a true saint. And even sainthood is a matter of grace, not effort.
So after all that, we're left with this huge, unresolvable ambiguity. If both the scientific man and the religious man seem to fall short of true liberation, what's the takeaway?
The ambiguity forces you to find a way to live astride both worlds, the visible and the invisible, without giving either one the final say. It brings us back to that powerful line from William James.
Son of man, stand upon your own feet so that I may speak with you.
That is such a staggering directive, isn't it? It cuts right through the whole debate. If you lean too much on God, you don't do what you need to do in this world with your own power.
But if you lean too much on your own power, you become small and self-obsessed like Freud.
Exactly. It's the great, probably unsolvable paradox. And that's what leads to the priority of action. To do anything significant, to even just live a full life, you first have to be a man, a person, apart from all the dogma and all the science.
Which highlights the power of what the source calls the irrational life force.
Absolutely. This raw, vital energy that just drives organisms to burn as brightly as they can. They serve nature's purpose best when they are most relentless, whether they end up a saint or a genius or just consumed.
So it's an argument for the value of passion and creativity itself, regardless of the philosophical justification.
That life force is the first priority. It demands its own kind of heroism, one built on just pure, vital energy.
Okay, so if we're saying that this ultimate anxiety-free life is pretty much impossible, it's a matter of grace, not just trying harder, then we have to look at these modern movements that argue the complete opposite.
Yes, the prophets of unrepression.
Right. They argue that man can evolve beyond his neurotic character through some kind of radical psychological breakthrough.
This brings us to some major figures from the mid-20th century, people like Herbert Marcuse and especially Norman Brown. Their whole argument is that the life force, the libido, can finally break free of all the limits, all the cultural restrictions.
Their goal is a whole new kind of human being.
A new state of being, yeah. Free from all that neurotic character armor we build up.
Let's focus on Norman Brown's book, Life Against Death. It was hugely influential, but the source notes it became popular for all the wrong reasons, for its utopian conclusions.
Brown's vision is just breathtakingly ambitious. He argues that humanity can finally transcend the fear of death by living the body fully, without denial, without shame, without guilt. If we could just live completely in the present moment, the fear of death would lose its power over us. So for him, the number one enemy is basic repression.
And his solution to that?
Brown says the human ego would have to become strong enough to die. strong enough to just set aside guilt and shame, which he says are just the result of infantile fantasy.
So guilt is just a childhood mistake, something a strong adult ego can just decide to get over.
That's the proposal. And this is where the source delivers this really harsh critique. It calls this a shocking fallacy, especially coming from a thinker with Brown's power.
Because guilt isn't just a fantasy.
No, guilt is a function of real overwhelmingness. It's a response to the stark majesty of the objects in the child's world. We're talking about the raw, terrifying, unblunted reality of existence that a child has to face. The only thing that could overcome that kind of existential guilt is the strength of a god. You literally have to be a god, not a creature.
So guilt isn't a developmental bug, it's a feature. It's a necessary response to reality itself.
Exactly. And you get a chilling glimpse of that raw reality from poets who never quite built up the normal defenses, like R.L. Stevenson.
What did he say?
He described this constant raw perception of the world. He said, "I cannot get used to this world. The commonest things are a burthen, the prim, obliterated, polite surface of life, and the broad body and orgiastic foundations form a spectacle to which no habit reconciles me."
Wow. He's describing reality without the armor, without the repression.
And if that's what reality is, this terrifying spectacle, then of course the ego has to build defenses. Brown's whole vision fails because he misunderstands where the anxiety comes from. And that leads directly to the second major failure of these utopian thinkers.
Which is the necessity of repression itself. We usually think of repression as a bad thing.
We do. But thinkers like Rank argued that the child represses himself. It's an active choice, a self-imposed limit.
It's not just about denying sexual urges.
No, it's a reaction to the overwhelming totality of existence. It's a vital, necessary function. It lets a child act without being crippled by anxiety. It lets the ego emerge and build a coherent identity. How can you have a new man without guilt if the child, just to become human, has to put limits on his own experience?
This really hits the core of Brown's biological argument, too. He claimed the ego was meant to be a body ego. The mind-body split was some kind of evolutionary mistake.
And that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what the ego does.
Yeah.
The ego, the ability to symbolize, to delay gratification, to think about the past and future, that's an attainment of more life. It's a step toward a kind of subdivinity. For the ego to develop, it has to disengage from the overwhelming immediacy of the body.
If the child doesn't delay its impulses, it's just an automaton.
Precisely. So to talk about a new man whose ego just merges back into his body, you're not talking about a superhuman. You're talking about a subhuman creature driven only by biology.
And what about Marcuse? He also falls into this prophetic trap.
He does, though he's a little less daring than Brown. Marcuse also calls for unrepression, but his whole argument gets torpedoed by his own brutal honesty.
What was his insight?
He admitted it himself. He said, The brute fact of death denies once and for all the reality of a non-repressive existence. He knew that our finite time here means we have to strive, to repress, to become heroes.
So if he knew that, why keep pushing the utopian idea? Why do these brilliant thinkers just undermine their own best arguments?
It's the prophetic role. They see their task as gigantic a critique of all of society, so they cast themselves in this equally gigantic role, and if you admit that death is the ultimate limit, your whole thesis becomes ambiguous and compromised.
You become a tragic revolutionary.
And no straightforward prophet wants that. They want a total solution, a clean win in their lifetime.
Which brings us to the counter-prophet, Philip Rieff. He just flips the whole thing on its head. He says repression isn't a lie.
It's truth. The only truth we can know, because we can't possibly experience everything. Rieff's position is this really classical, stoic acceptance of limits. We should be grateful for the compromises we make.
He has that incredible phrase about the internal structures we build.
Oh, it's beautiful. The heaviest crosses are internal, and men make them so that, thus skeletally supported, they can bear the burden of their flesh.
An inner cross, an internal skeleton of morality and control. So culture, the superego, they aren't prisons. They're what make life bearable.
Exactly. Rieff is arguing against this all-or-nothing utopian dream. And the reason the utopians fail is they ignore the universality of transference. We need our morality incarnate in enactable characters.
We need heroes. Jesus, a shaman, a guru.
We need points of support against the terrifying chaos of nature. Abstract ideas just don't cut it. We need mediators.
Okay, so we've established that the human condition is fundamentally tragic. It requires repression, it requires heroic myths, and this leads to this really painful dilemma about self-knowledge itself.
The novelist Andre Malraux put it perfectly. He said it takes 60 years of suffering and effort to make a unique person.
And then he is good only for dying.
It's the ultimate cosmic joke. The more you develop, the more liberated you become, the more you see the full, tragic reality of things, which leads to the real despair of the human condition.
So once you really accept how tragic it all is, you realize neurosis is normal.
And that self-knowledge, which we think of as this ultimate cure, can actually destroy some people by taking away the illusions they need to function.
There's a crucial anecdote about Otto Rank that just illustrates this so powerfully. The story of the 35-year-old unmarried woman with the intestinal symptoms.
Right, so she comes to him with these painful intestinal attacks. But otherwise, her life is great. She's well-adjusted, loves her work, has friends. This one physical symptom is her only problem.
And Rank's response is just amazing.
It was so mature and sober, he basically asks her, why not keep the symptom? He explained that if they took that defense mechanism away, they had no idea what worse existential horror they might uncover underneath.
He said, probably this defense mechanism is her adjustment. Probably that is the price she has to pay. Right. One cannot ever have everything.
The implications of that are just huge. The question for a therapist isn't always, can we cure this, but should we? Sometimes a neurosis is the best deal you're going to get. It's the compromise that lets you live.
And that kind of realism is the complete opposite of what you see in modern therapeutic religion.
Oh, yeah. The books with the garish titles promising unrelieved joy and ultimate awakening. They promise psychological heaven on earth.
The beaming guru on the book cover who seems to have it all figured out.
Yeah.
But they don't tell you about the dangers of waking up too much.
They don't. Freud, for all his pessimism, was honest about this. He said he cured the miseries of the neurotic only to open him up to the normal misery of life.
Imagine putting that on your office door. Warning, I can get rid of your extra suffering, but I can't touch the baseline, inescapable suffering of being human.
Not a great business model. No prophet who wants paying customers can afford a message that ambiguous.
And this pressure forces psychology to become a new myth. It has to promise paradise through self-knowledge. And this is where Rank's later insight is so brilliant. He said, psychology is self-knowledge is self-deception, because it doesn't give people what they really, truly want.
Immortality.
Immortality.
So when a patient gives up their old immortality project, living under the protection of their parents or their culture psychology, has to step in and offer a new one, a new way to feel significant. And Rank saw 3 main ways it does this.
Okay, let's break down those 3 paths. How does psychology become a religion?
Okay, first, you can become a creative genius and use the field itself as your immortality vehicle. That's what Freud did. He leaves behind a legacy. Second, you can just adopt the jargon of the system, Oedipus complex, penis envy, whatever, as your lived belief system. Every anxiety, every fear gets filtered through this new Freudian or Jungian language. It becomes your religion.
And the third way feels the most current. It's when psychology becomes a full-blown mystery religion.
Yes. When you move away from just talking to these intense experiential therapies, screaming, catharsis, acting out traumas, the therapy session becomes a holy ritual. And the logical extension of that is the therapist has to become the guru figure, the shaman.
Which explains the explosion of psychological gurus. It's the logical endpoint of our need to find an external source of power.
And the crucial thing to understand is that your new freedom isn't coming from your own mature center. It's coming from what's called transference certification by the guru.
Transference certification. Can we unpack that term?
Sure. Transference is just that basic dynamic where you project feelings about past authority figures, like your parents, onto the therapist. So transference certification means your new worldview, your new confidence, it's all propped up by your relationship with the guru, not by your own autonomous self-discovery.
So the guru has this halo effect, and you become a slavish admirer, never realizing your new worldview is based on another illusion.
And you see the exact same dynamic when Westerners turn to Eastern practices. Zen, Hindu discipleship. It often involves this intentional breakdown, so the disciple has to rely on these primal cosmic powers.
But that usually requires a long submission to a master, and people become reliant on fetishized magical means.
Exactly. A specific bow, a breathing technique, a mantra. You're told you're learning to function from your own center, but your sense of power still depends on the guru's approval or these rigid, magical methods.
Which brings us back to Tillich's critique of Western mysticism.
Tillich argued that for Westerners, this is an evasion because it lacks the essential element of skepticism. For Tillich, skepticism was a more radical experience, a more manly confrontation of potential meaninglessness. True religious faith in the West requires looking into the abyss, confronting the idea that it might all be meaningless, and still finding the courage to be.
And popular mysticism is often just a defense against that,
Yeah.
a way to avoid that truly manly confrontation.
So this whole critique of therapy and mysticism, it brings us right back to the remorseless reality of it all. Freud's late career pessimism, the sense that we're doomed to live in this tragic, demonic world that feels like the most realistic view.
And this is a really painful truth, isn't it? The therapeutic revolution, even at its best, can't change that fundamental reality.
Tillich warned about this. He said the new being, the liberated person, will only find new and sharper paradoxes, new tensions, and more painful disharmonies. They'll feel the tragedy of the world more acutely, not less.
Which is where we have to critique what the source calls therapeutic megalomania.
Right, this arrogance that comes from getting liberated in a hothouse atmosphere, a privileged society.
If you find your bliss in Berkeley or Manhattan, you're shutting out the vast majority of the globe who don't have the luxury of self-analysis.
Exactly. Analyzing your Oedipus complex doesn't change the facts of global poverty or brutality. True courage has to engage with that.
So the alternative to all these fantasies is to face what the source calls the lived truth of creation. The world as it appears to the unarmored, the shaman, the poet, the saint. And that reality is defined by one thing.
Pervasive, profound panic, it is. And the description of this lived truth is just. It's visceral and terrifying. The source calls it the nightmare spectacular.
Let's just sit with that image for a second. The nightmare spectacular.
I mean, think about the biological reality underneath it all. This world is a place where organisms just tear each other apart, grinding flesh, pushing pulp down gullets, mosquitoes bloating on blood, sharks tearing and swallowing even as they're being disemboweled. The planet has been soaked for hundreds of millions of years in the blood of all its creatures.
The conclusion is that the entire planet is being turned into a vast pit of fertilizer.
That is a terrifyingly honest picture of reality. It really makes you wonder how anyone gets out of bed, and that primal panic is just reinforced by modern life. Earthquakes, car crashes, tidal waves. That panic is always simmering right below the surface of everything.
And this is what science often tries to fix through manipulation and denial.
Behaviorists like Skinner or people calling for chemicals to deaden aggression, they're trying to legislate the grotesque out of it, to program reality to be something other than it is. Even Freud considered mixing the copper of suggestion into the pure gold of psychoanalysis because the truth was too harsh for most people.
He admitted the evil wasn't just inside us, but on the outside, in nature. And that's the problem with the manipulators, isn't it? They don't take life seriously enough.
Taking life seriously means you achieve what you achieve from within the lived truth of the terror of creation, using all of it, the passion, the pain, the fear, the sorrow. To take that pain away is to empty the struggle of its human meaning.
The struggle against the terror is what creates the meaning.
And that sacred urge to be a cosmic hero, that can't be rationalized or drugged away. It's the irrational life force pushing for its own expansion. Which brings us to that profound question from the poet Rilke.
He asked why we know, deep down, that our part in the meaning of the universe might not be a rhythm in sorrow.
Right. Maybe the highest meaning isn't in happiness, but in the heroic confrontation with sorrow. And from that angle, science is just another immortality vehicle, another way to try and control the fear of life and death.
So if modern man is just self-medicating or getting lost in therapy, what's the actual way forward?
The conclusion from thinkers like Rank and Lifton is stark. Psychology was born when our shared social heroisms, religion, nation, culture broke down. It can only be surpassed by creating new heroisms.
And those new heroisms are basically matters of belief and will, dedication to a vision.
It means we have to accept Rank's final stance. Our orientation has to be beyond our bodies, grounded in healthy repressions, and aimed at explicit immortality ideologies and myths of heroic transcendence. It's an embrace of belief, not an escape into some anxiety-free fantasy.
The grand project can't be programmed or analyzed away.
No. It emerges from the vital energies of people sweating it out inside the nightmare of creation. Our future is rooted in that anguish, and the price of admission is the courage to face it.
So we've traveled across this immense intellectual battlefield, from Freud's harsh pessimism to Kierkegaard's beautiful but impossible ideal, and then through the failures of these utopian prophets of unrepression.
It's been a journey.
And the unifying insight here, the big takeaway, is that this whole fight between psychology and religion, it reveals this one necessary and impossible paradox.
And that paradox is that we're built on a contradiction. We can't get rid of our deep unconscious need for heroic meaning for our immortality formulas, but we also can't escape the limits of being a creature. We need compromise, we need repression, just to function.
So the modern search for this perfect, anxiety-free, unrepressed life.
It's a betrayal of our potential for real heroic action.
And the most immediate, tangible thing to take away from all this history is a new definition of courage. It's not about finding an escape route.
No. True courage, for Tillich, is the courage to be. And that means you have to willingly absorb the maximum amount of non-being, all the meaninglessness, the terror, the sorrow into yourself, without shattering.
That's what turns daily life into a duty of cosmic proportions.
And critically, Tillich warned that popular mysticism, because it tries to avoid that confrontation, is an evasion of this manly confrontation.
That is a seriously challenging way to live. So if even the greatest minds, Freud, who knew the limits, and Marcuse, who denied them, if they all ultimately failed to solve the riddle of existence, and if real heroism is found in facing the terror without illusion,
then the provocative thought we want to leave you with is this. What creative myth are you using right now to contain the inevitable anxiety of being alive and to give your actions a sense of cosmic meaning? And knowing that every myth requires a price, what necessary compromise, what neurosis, what denial are you currently paying to maintain that heroic vision of yourself? Think on that until next time.